I never thought I'd be the one to write this story. To be honest, I didn't think I'd end up in a situation like this. My name is Sarah, I'm 29 years old, and life is a lot messier than I ever imagined. I'm not special, not in any way that I'd like to be. But I'm here now, sharing this because, well, I think there are lessons to be learned. Maybe not for me, because I'm still figuring it out, but maybe for someone else, someone who might be standing on the edge of making the same mistake I did. I've always been a bit of an overachiever, or at least, that's what I tell myself. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone's business, and the only way out was to prove you were something more. So, I moved to the city at 18, got my degree in marketing, and somehow found myself working for a growing company, with more responsibilities than I could keep track of. At first, it felt like everything was falling into place. My life was moving in the right direction. Or so I thought. David and I met right after college. He was charming, steady, the kind of person who could make you feel like everything was going to be okay. He worked as a financial analyst, and when we first started dating, I was amazed by how grounded he seemed. He was practical, focused, and a little serious, but in a way that balanced me out. I was always the one dreaming up plans that didn't always have a clear path, and David was the one who could help make them a reality. We married 2 years after we met, in a small ceremony with close friends and family. I loved him, and I thought I was living the dream. I had a steady job, a supportive husband, and a comfortable life. But somewhere along the way, things started to feel a little off. Not in a dramatic, obvious way, there were no loud arguments or dramatic fights. It was more subtle. We didn't talk as much. We didn't laugh as much. The little things that used to bring us closer seemed to slip away unnoticed. I didn't want to admit it, but I started to feel bored. I wasn't unhappy, but I wasn't exactly fulfilled either. And I think, deep down, I knew that I was missing something more exciting, more fulfilling. I was craving something beyond the routine, beyond the security. That's when it happened. The invitation. Mark, my boss, had been someone I worked closely with for the last year. He was the kind of guy who always knew exactly what to say in any situation, and I found myself drawn to his charisma, his confidence. He'd always been respectful, professional, but there was this energy about him that made everything feel a little more exciting, a little more alive. One evening, after a particularly long week of work, Mark invited me out for dinner to thank me for my hard work on a project. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary. He wasn't asking me on a date, he was just being gracious. But when I told David about the dinner, I noticed a shift in his demeanor. He looked at me, not with anger, but with something else, disappointment? Worry? I couldn't place it. Are you sure you want to go? He asked, his voice quiet, but there was a hint of something deeper there. We haven't had a night to ourselves in ages. I shrugged it off. It's just dinner, David. Nothing to worry about. But I could see it in his eyes. He didn't believe me, and that feeling, the sense of him doubting me, it stayed with me the rest of the day. Yet, I convinced myself it didn't matter. It was just dinner, after all. What harm could there be? And so, I went. I didn't think it was a big deal. I told myself I was being reasonable, professional. But now, looking back, I know that was the moment things started to unravel. That one small choice set everything into motion. But I didn't see it then. I couldn't. I was too busy chasing something I thought I needed, too blinded by the idea of feeling important in a way that had nothing to do with the life I'd built. And that's where this story begins. The evening came quickly. The anticipation, or maybe it was just the need for a break, seemed to weigh on me as I dressed for the dinner. I told myself it would be nice to have a night out, away from the same old routine. The thought of escaping the monotony for a while seemed comforting. I didn't think it would mean anything more. But now, looking back, I know how naive I was. David was still at work when I finished getting ready. He'd barely looked up from his laptop when I mentioned the dinner again. It was almost as if he hadn't heard me at all. His gaze stayed fixed on the screen, his fingers moving over the keyboard with no hesitation. I stood there for a moment, waiting for him to respond. To say something. But there was only silence, so I shrugged it off and said, "I'll be back around 10. David didn't reply, and for some reason, that stung more than it should have. I told myself it was just work, just stress. He'd be fine. When I arrived at the restaurant, Mark was already there, sitting at a corner table near the window. The place was elegant, with dim lighting and the soft hum of conversations around us. As soon as he saw me, Mark stood and greeted me with a smile that made me feel like I was important. He held out his hand, his gaze lingering a bit longer than necessary. The charm was undeniable, and for a moment, I felt seen in a way that I hadn't in a long time. We sat down, and the conversation flowed easily. It was effortless, almost as if we had known each other for years instead of just a few months. He asked about my projects at work, about how things were going at home. I spoke about David, about how we'd been doing well, but how things felt a little distant lately. I mentioned how we hadn't had a chance to go out, just the two of us, in what felt like ages. Mark listened attentively, nodding thoughtfully. "Relationships can get complicated, you know," he said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "You get caught up in the little things and forget why you started in the first place." I nodded, unsure whether I was hearing advice or just his own personal view on things. But there was something in his words that resonated with me. He wasn't wrong. I had forgotten, hadn't I? I had gotten so wrapped up in the day-to-day grind that I hadn't stopped to think about what I really wanted or needed. Mark's hand rested lightly on the table, and as we continued talking, the space between us seemed to shrink. I couldn't quite explain it, but there was an undeniable pull. It wasn't just physical, though. It was something more, an emotional connection I hadn't realized I was missing. I didn't see it coming. I wasn't looking for it, nor did I expect it. But by the time the dessert arrived, I found myself laughing more than I had in months. Mark's wit was sharp, his humor infectious. He made everything feel easy, comfortable. I wasn't thinking about David. I wasn't thinking about anything except the conversation, the connection we were building. It was all so effortless. And yet, somewhere deep down, a small voice was warning me. But I ignored it. I convinced myself that it was just one evening, just one dinner with a colleague. Nothing would change. The night wore on, and as the clock ticked past 9, I realized I had no desire to go home. The thought of going back to David, of facing the quiet emptiness that had started to grow between us, seemed overwhelming. "You don't have to go back so soon, you know," Mark said, as he leaned back in his chair, his tone softening. "We could grab another drink. It's still early." It wasn't the suggestion that made me pause, it was the way he said it. It felt inviting, safe, as though he understood something I hadn't yet admitted to myself. Something was stirring inside me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe it was the attention, the way Mark made me feel like I mattered, or maybe it was just the escape from everything that had been building up. I hesitated. I glanced at my phone, and there it was, a message from David. "Where are you?" I sighed, trying to suppress the guilt that started creeping in. But instead of replying right away, I put the phone down and looked at Mark. He was waiting for me to make a decision, but for the first time that night, I didn't want to. I didn't want to think about the consequences. I just wanted to stay in the moment, to enjoy the feeling of being seen, of being wanted. So, I stayed. And with that, I unknowingly sealed my fate. The next morning was one of those mornings where everything feels off. I woke up with a headache, my mind cloudy from too much wine and too many late-night thoughts. The moment I opened my eyes, I knew something was different, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I looked at the clock. It was 7:30 a.m. I had already missed my alarm. I quickly got out of bed and rushed through my morning routine, trying to shake off the remnants of the night before. The guilt was there, lurking beneath the surface, but I tried to push it down. Mark had been charming, sure, but nothing had happened between us. It was just dinner, I told myself. Just a night out. I texted David, apologizing for being late, trying to convince myself that everything would be fine. There was no response. I didn't think much of it at first, maybe he was busy with work. But as I stepped into the living room, I felt the heavy silence in the air. David wasn't home. I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was. He'd left a note on the kitchen counter. "I'll be back in a few hours. We need to talk." Those words hit me like a punch in the gut. We need to talk. It's a phrase that always seems to signal trouble, and deep down, I knew exactly what this was about. He knew. Somehow, he knew. I had tried to convince myself that nothing had changed, but the truth was everything had. And it wasn't just the night with Mark, it was everything leading up to it. The distance between David and me had been growing for months, maybe even longer. But last night had been the final straw, the tipping point. I made myself a quick cup of coffee, my hands trembling slightly as I watched the steam rise from the mug. I didn't know what to expect when David came home. I had no idea how he'd react, but I knew it wouldn't be good. He had always been a calm, collected person, but there was something about the way he held his emotions and that made everything seem more intense when he finally let them out. When David came home a couple of hours later, his face was unreadable. I could tell he'd been thinking, pacing, trying to come to terms with whatever he had learned. The air between us felt thick, suffocating. I didn't know where to start, so I said the only thing I could think of. "I'm sorry, David. I shouldn't have gone out last night. It was just dinner, nothing more. You know I love you." He looked at me, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he were weighing every word I said. There was no emotion in his face, no softness in his voice. "Do you think I'm stupid?" His words stung more than I expected. I shook my head quickly, trying to defend myself. "No, I don't think that. But it was just dinner. Nothing happened." David stepped closer to me, his voice barely above a whisper but sharp, like a knife. "You went out with him instead of me. I don't care what you say. It's not about dinner. It's about the fact that you chose him over me." The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy blanket. I felt trapped, like I was suffocating in my own guilt. I had chosen Mark. I had chosen the excitement, the attention, the escape from the life I'd been leading with David. "You're right," I whispered. "I didn't think about it like that." David's eyes hardened, and I saw the hurt there. The hurt that I had caused. He had always been the type to bottle things up, but when he finally let go, it was explosive. And I could see it in the way he stood there, his fists clenched at his sides. "I can't do this anymore, Sarah," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I can't keep living in a relationship where I'm not enough. You're always looking for something more, and I don't know how to fix that." His words hit me harder than anything else he could have said. I had never imagined that this would be the result. I never thought my actions, my need for something different, something exciting, would lead to this. "I never wanted to hurt you, David," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I think I've been hurting both of us for a long time." The silence that followed was deafening. Neither of us knew how to move forward. He stood there, staring at me with a mixture of disbelief and sadness. I wanted to reach out to him, to apologize, to fix everything. But I knew it was too late. David didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he shook his head slowly, as if he was saying goodbye to something he had already lost. "I need space, Sarah. I need to figure things out." And just like that, the man I had loved, the man I thought I would spend the rest of my life with, was walking away. The days after David left were filled with a suffocating silence. The house felt too big, too empty without him. I tried to go about my routine, work, and errands, but everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. My mind kept replaying the conversation, the finality in his voice. I couldn't stop thinking about how everything had unraveled so quickly, how my decision to spend one evening with Mark had spiraled into the collapse of my marriage. I kept myself busy, cleaning the house, rearranging things, hoping that some task, some distraction, would take my mind off the ache in my chest. But nothing worked. Every corner of the house reminded me of him. The kitchen counter where we used to sit and have coffee together. The couch where we'd watch movies on lazy weekends. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape him. And then, there was the guilt. It ate at me every minute. It wasn't just about that one night, it was about everything that had led up to it. I had ignored the warning signs in my marriage, brushed aside the little cracks that had started appearing months ago. David had been distant for a long time, but I had been too caught up in my own world to notice. The silence between us had become a daily routine, one we both accepted but never spoke of. I hadn't realized how much I missed him until he was gone. The reality of it hit me like a wave, sweeping over me all at once. I missed his smile, the way he always made sure I had everything I needed. I missed his quiet presence, the way he could sit in the same room as me without speaking and still make me feel less alone. But it wasn't just missing him, it was realizing what I had lost. I had made a choice, and now I had to live with the consequences. The coldness in his eyes when he left had been a wake-up call I hadn't wanted. I had taken him for granted, assuming he would always be there, that he would always forgive me, that we could go back to the way things were. But I was wrong. David was done, and the realization of that stung more than I could have ever anticipated. The phone buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. I looked at the screen. It was a message from Mark. "I've been thinking about you. I hope you're okay." I stared at the message for a moment, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to reach out to him, to talk about what had happened, to seek comfort in someone who had been there when I needed an escape. But another part of me knew better. I had already made one mistake, and I couldn't afford to make another. Mark wasn't the solution. He was just a distraction, a temporary fix for something much deeper. I put the phone down, my fingers trembling. I didn't know what I was looking for anymore. I didn't know how to fix what I had broken. That night, I sat alone in the living room, the weight of my choices pressing down on me. The quiet felt suffocating. I realized then that I wasn't just grieving the loss of David, I was grieving the loss of myself. Somewhere along the way, I had lost sight of who I was, what I wanted, and what I truly needed. The reflection staring back at me from the mirror no longer felt familiar. I had become someone I didn't recognize, someone I wasn't proud of. And that was when it hit me. I had to change. Not just for David, not just for the marriage I had destroyed, but for myself. I couldn't keep running from the truth. I needed to face it. The pain, the guilt, everything. It was time to take responsibility for my actions and make the difficult choice to rebuild my life. I didn't know where to start, but I knew I had to start somewhere. The days after David left blurred into each other. I kept my distance from Mark, unable to face him, knowing that what had happened between us had been a mistake. I focused on myself, on the things I had been neglecting for so long. The realization that I had allowed myself to drift so far from the person I wanted to be weighed heavily on me. I spent hours in silence, reflecting on my actions, trying to understand why I had made the choices I did. I started small. I picked up my old hobbies, the ones I had abandoned when life became too hectic. I spent evenings reading again, rediscovering the joy I had once found in simple moments. I reached out to friends, reconnected with people who had always supported me, but whom I had lost touch with over the years. Slowly, I started to rebuild the parts of myself that had been buried under layers of guilt and regret. But even as I took these steps toward healing, the absence of David was impossible to ignore. I missed him in ways I didn't know how to explain. There was a deep emptiness where once there had been companionship, shared laughter, and love. I thought about the small things, the way he would leave little notes for me, or how he would always make my favorite tea when I had a rough day. Those memories haunted me, reminding me of what I had lost. One evening, I was sitting on the balcony, enjoying the cool breeze, when my phone buzzed. It was a message from David. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it. "We need to talk." The words sent a surge of panic through me. I hadn't expected this. After everything that had happened, I wasn't sure what to think. Was he angry? Had he forgiven me? Or was he just tying up loose ends? We agreed to meet the following day. As I prepared to see him, I tried to keep my expectations in check. I knew that no matter what, things had changed between us, and nothing would ever be the same again. But I also knew that this conversation was necessary, not just for us, but for my own closure. When I saw him the next day, it felt like stepping into a dream, a world where everything had shifted. David looked the same, yet somehow different. There was a weariness in his eyes, a quiet sadness that hadn't been there before. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," he said, his voice calm but heavy with emotion. "And I realized something." My stomach twisted with anticipation, but I stayed quiet, letting him speak. "I think I've been running from something too," he continued. "I've been holding on to resentment, holding on to the past, and I didn't realize how much it was affecting everything." I could feel the weight of his words. It was clear that David, too, had been carrying his own burden, his own regrets. We had both been lost in different ways, and maybe, just maybe, we had both been waiting for the other to make the first move. "I'm not saying we can fix everything," David said, looking down at his hands. "But I think we can try. I think we both owe it to ourselves to give it another shot." My breath caught in my throat. Was he saying what I thought he was saying? I wasn't sure, but I knew that this was a step forward. This wasn't about picking up where we left off, it was about starting fresh, acknowledging our mistakes, and working through them together. "I'm willing to try," I said softly, my heart full of hope I hadn't felt in months. "But I need to know that we can both change, that we're willing to do the work, not just for the marriage, but for ourselves." David nodded, his eyes meeting mine with a quiet understanding. "I'm ready." As we sat there, talking through our fears, our hopes, and our dreams, I realized that this wasn't just about fixing a broken relationship. It was about healing, both individually and together. We were no longer the people we had been before, the mistakes, the hurt, the pain, had all changed us. But perhaps, in some way, that was what we needed to grow. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. We both knew that. But for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace. A sense that, despite everything, this could be a new beginning.